we bring you the unvarnished truth of law enforcement. This broadcast features unfiltered, unedited, and completely raw footage. Join us as we step onto the front lines of justice, providing a transparent view of the critical moments that shape our society.
You don't look like staff. Move now.
I'm Federal Coast Guard. I'm cleared to be here.
Don't reach for anything.
Verify it. Call Port Command.
Turn around. You're being detained.
For asking you to verify?
Until I know who you are.
Your radio's right there.
The cruise terminal was already alive with movement. Rolling suitcases rattled across concrete. A departure horn echoed from the harbor. Sunlight bounced off the white hull of a massive cruise ship docked just beyond the security gates. Families clustered together, passports in hand, voices layered with anticipation. Lieutenant Marcus Hill stood near the terminal entrance, backpack slung over one shoulder, phone vibrating in his pocket. He wore jeans, a plain jacket, nothing that marked him as active-duty Coast Guard. He had arrived early, as he always did, tasked with a quiet coordination role tied to port security. Nothing dramatic, nothing public. "You can't stand here," a voice said sharply. Hill turned. A local police officer stepped into his space chest forward, hand already gesturing away from the checkpoint line. "This is a restricted area. Move along." Hill glanced behind him, then back. "I'm cleared to be here. I'm waiting for a contact inside." The officer's eyes traveled over Hill slowly, from his shoes to his face. "That doesn't matter. This area is for passengers and staff only." Hill shifted his weight but didn't raise his voice. "I am staff. Federal." The word landed and slid off. The officer stepped closer. "You don't look like staff." Hill felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. He reached into his jacket, slightly stopping short. "My identification is in my wallet. I can show you." "Don't reach for anything," the officer snapped. The line of passengers slowed. A woman with a wide-brim hat stopped rolling her suitcase. A man lifted his phone casually, pretending to check a message while the camera lens pointed outward. The terminal noise softened curiosity, pulling attention inward. Hill lowered his hands. "I'm complying. I'm just asking you to confirm before this escalates." The officer laughed, once short and humorless. "You're the one escalating." Without warning, the officer shoved him backward. Not enough to knock him down. Enough to make a point. Hill's foot slid on the smooth concrete. His shoulder hit a metal barrier with a dull sound that cut through the chatter. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone said, "Hey." Someone else said that wasn't necessary. Hill straightened slowly, jaw-tight hands open at his sides. "Do not touch me again," he said evenly. "I am a United States Coast Guard officer." The officer froze for half a second, then scoffed. "Sure you are." Behind them, a cruise ship horn sounded again, long and low, as cameras kept recording, and the distance between a routine morning and a career-ending mistake collapsed to nothing. The story pulls away from the terminal and moves backward long before the shove and the watching crowd. Marcus Hill grew up near water. Not the postcard kind, but working harbors where ships came and went on schedules that didn't care about weather or holidays. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father repaired engines and taught him early that rules existed for a reason, but discipline existed to protect others. By the time Marcus was 16, he knew 2 things clearly. He wanted to serve and he wanted structure. The Coast Guard offered both. Boot camp stripped away hesitation quickly. Cold mornings, salt air, commands delivered without explanation. Hill learned how to listen first and react second. He learned that authority without restraint was a liability, not a strength. Over the years, that lesson followed him through assignments most people never noticed. Port security rotations. Joint task forces with Customs and Border Protection. Quiet coordination roles where mistakes didn't make headlines but prevented them. Hill rose steadily. Evaluations described him as composed, dependable, precise. The kind of officer trusted to work alongside local law enforcement without friction. He had de-escalated tense situations at ports before standing between nervous civilians and armed authority, translating urgency into calm. That skill was why he was at the cruise terminal that morning, assigned to coordinate with port security, ahead of a high-volume departure. He dressed down deliberately. No uniform, no insignia. Blend in, observe, report. It was standard practice. The officer who confronted him came from a different path. Officer Ryan Becker had been with the city police department for 7 years, most of them assigned to tourist zones and special events. Cruise days were loud, crowded, unpredictable. Supervisors pushed one message repeatedly. Maintain control. Don't let anything look messy. Image mattered as much as safety when thousands of visitors were watching. Becker's record showed efficiency. High compliance rates. Few complaints that went anywhere. He believed firmness prevented problems. He believed hesitation invited them. When people challenged him, he saw it as disrespect, not clarification. At the terminal that morning, Becker was already irritated. Staffing was short. Lines were backing up. Radios chirped non-stop. Then he noticed Hill standing near the restricted lane backpack slung casually, not moving with the flow. To Becker, that was a disruption. He didn't see a federal officer coordinating security. He saw someone who didn't belong and didn't look intimidated enough. That distinction mattered. When Hill said, "Federal," Becker heard defiance. When Hill offered identification, Becker saw a challenge to his authority in front of a crowd he was supposed to control. Years of reinforcement told him one thing. If you let that slide, you lose the scene. So he closed the distance instead of creating it. The shove at the terminal was not an accident. It was a reflex shaped by environment training and unchecked confidence. A physical assertion meant to end a conversation rather than verify it. What Becker didn't know was that Hill's role put him one call away from agencies Becker had never interacted with directly. He didn't know that the terminal cameras were clearer than body cams. He didn't know that the Coast Guard command structure treated interference with its officers as a federal issue, not a local misunderstanding. Two careers were already intersecting on a path that could not be reversed, and the distance between them, measured in minutes, was about to shrink to seconds. The escalation happened in layers, each one tightening the space around them. Passengers stopped pretending not to watch. Suitcases stood abandoned in neat lines. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking why the man was being yelled at. Phones were no longer hidden. They were raised openly now, lenses steady framing Hill and the officer in the same shot. Marcus Hill did not move toward the officer. He did not step away either. He stood where he had been shoved, shoulders squared, hands open, voice level. "I am requesting that you call Port Command or your supervisor. This can be resolved in minutes." Officer Becker shook his head and stepped closer again, chest nearly touching Hill's jacket. "You don't get to give instructions here. You were told to move and you refused." Hill met his eyes. "I did not refuse. I asked for verification." That distinction meant nothing to Becker. It meant everything to the cameras. A port security employee approached cautiously, badge visible, palms out. "Officer, maybe we should just check his credentials." Becker didn't look at him. "Step back," he said. "This doesn't involve you." The employee hesitated, then stepped back but stayed close enough to hear. Behind him, a couple from Ohio whispered to each other. Another passenger muttered, "He didn't do anything." A man near the curb said louder, "You can't just push people like that." Becker turned his head sharply toward the voice. "Sir, mind your business." The man lifted his phone higher instead of responding. Hill felt the moment tipping. The crowd was no longer passive. Authority was being measured in real time against behavior. He spoke again carefully. "Officer, I am on federal assignment related to port security. You are interfering with that assignment." Becker laughed a short bark that drew more attention. "Now you're threatening me." Hill shook his head once. "I am stating a fact." That was when Becker's hand came up again. Not a shove this time, but a firm grip on Hill's shoulder, spinning him slightly toward the barrier. "Stay right there," Becker said. "Don't move." Hill's foot slid half an inch. He caught himself immediately. The metal railing rattled softly behind him. The sound carried. Gasps followed. Someone in the crowd said his rank out loud for the first time. He said he's Coast Guard. Another voice followed. "That's federal." Becker froze for a fraction of a second, then tightened his grip instead of releasing it. His face hardened. "You're being detained," he said. Hill looked straight ahead. "On what grounds?" "Failure to comply." Hill exhaled slowly. He knew this line. He had trained others on it. Compliance had already happened. Escalation was the choice being made now. Behind them, a terminal security camera pivoted slightly, tracking movement. Above them, mounted cameras caught everything from a fixed angle. The cruise ship's boarding announcement echoed faintly through speakers, surreal against the tension unfolding at ground level. Becker radioed in, voice clipped. "I have an uncooperative male refusing to leave a restricted area. Possible impersonation. Requesting supervisor." Hill closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Impersonation was the word that always came last when verification was ignored. He said nothing more. There was nothing left to clarify on the ground. The crowd had grown silent. Phones stayed raised. No one intervened physically, but no one looked away. The terminal had become a stage, and escalation was no longer contained between two men. It belonged to everyone watching. And somewhere just beyond the line of parked cruisers and security gates, a call was connecting that would collapse this entire narrative in minutes. The injustice did not explode. It unfolded with controlled force. Officer Becker tightened his grip and guided Marcus Hill toward the side of the terminal, away from the passenger flow and closer to a steel service barrier marked with faded warning paint. Not violently, intentionally. The kind of movement designed to reassert dominance without drawing immediate intervention. Hill felt the pressure in his shoulder, the imbalance, as his foot caught slightly on the uneven concrete. "Turn around," Becker said. Hill paused for half a second, then complied. He turned slowly, hands visible, posture straight. The backpack slid down one shoulder and bumped softly against the barrier. The terminal noise seemed to dull, replaced by the low hum of the ship's engines and the distant call of seabirds over the harbor. Becker reached for Hill's arms. Metal clicked. The handcuffs closed around his wrists, cold and final. Not tight enough to injure, but tight enough to send a message. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone else said, "Are you serious right now?" Hill did not resist. He did not speak. He adjusted his breathing the way he had been trained to do under stress, slow and even. His eyes fixed on a point ahead, jaw set, muscles controlled. The discipline that had carried him through storms at sea now kept him still on dry land. "You're being detained pending investigation," Becker announced, voice raised for the crowd to hear. Failure to comply and suspected impersonation of a federal officer. That word again, impersonation. Hill felt it land with weight. Not because it was true, but because of what it signaled. Verification had been replaced with accusation, process had given way to narrative. A port supervisor stepped forward instinctively, then stopped when Becker shot him a look. "Stay back. This is police business." The supervisor hesitated, hands hovering at his sides, eyes darting between Hill and the cameras overhead. He stepped back, but not far. Phones were everywhere now. Close, far, above heads, from behind luggage stacks, from the upper-level balcony overlooking the terminal floor. Every angle caught the same image. A black man in cuffs, a uniformed officer squared in front of him. A crowd frozen between outrage and disbelief. Becker guided Hill another step back. Hill's calves brushed the barrier. The metal vibrated slightly. Becker leaned in. "You should have just moved," he said quietly. Hill turned his head just enough to be heard. "You should have verified." The moment hung there, sharp, uncomfortable. Becker straightened and keyed his radio again. Supervisor en route. Subject detained. Scene under control. His voice carried confidence that no longer matched the reality around him. Hill stood cuffed at the cruise terminal entrance, sunlight glinting off ship railings behind him, passengers watching from yards away. He thought briefly of the irony. Years enforcing maritime law. Years coordinating port security. Now restrained at the very edge of the infrastructure he helped protect. The injustice was complete, public, recorded, irreversible. And somewhere beyond the terminal glass and the hum of engines, a call was being answered that would turn those 12 minutes into the most expensive mistake of several careers. The revelation came fast, and it came from above. The port supervisor's phone vibrated first. He glanced at the screen, then looked up at Marcus Hill standing in cuffs against the barrier. He stepped a few feet away, voice low, urgent. "Yes, he's here. Yes, I understand." He turned eyes wide now, posture no longer uncertain. At the same time, Officer Becker's radio crackled sharply. "Becker, hold your position. Supervisor inbound. Do not escalate further." The tone was different. Controlled, alert. Two men in dark suits moved through the terminal doors from the administrative wing badges clipped openly at their waists. Behind them walked a senior Port Authority official, face tight, pace brisk. They did not look at the crowd first. They looked at Hill. One of the suited men stopped a few feet away. "Lieutenant Marcus Hill, United States Coast Guard," he said clearly, not as a question. Hill turned his head slightly. "Yes." That was the moment the air changed. The Port Authority official exhaled hard, rubbing his forehead. The suited man turned to Becker. "Why is a federal Coast Guard officer in restraints at my terminal?" Becker opened his mouth. He stopped. The explanation he had rehearsed no longer fit the facts standing in front of him. "He refused to leave a restricted area," Becker said finally. claimed to be federal. Claimed, the second suited man repeated quietly. He reached into his jacket and produced a tablet already unlocked. Hill's name was on the screen. Rank? Assignment. Clearance. Coordination detail scheduled for that exact terminal, that exact time. The suited man didn't raise his voice. Remove the cuffs, now. For half a second, Becker hesitated. Then the handcuffs opened. The metal released with a sound that cut cleanly through the terminal noise. Hill flexed his wrists slowly, methodically, checking circulation the way he had done after cold watches at sea. He rolled his shoulders once and stepped away from the barrier. The crowd reacted immediately. Murmurs rose. Phones tilted higher. Someone said they had him cuffed. Another voice answered, "That's Coast Guard." Becker stood frozen, eyes fixed on the ground. The confidence that had driven him minutes earlier drained out of his posture. His supervisor arrived just in time to see the tablet. The crowd, the cameras, the uncuffed man standing calmly where a detainee had been. The suited man turned to Hill. "Lieutenant, on behalf of the Port Authority and our federal partners, I apologize for this incident." Hill nodded once. He didn't accept or reject the apology. He acknowledged it. Then he spoke, voice steady, carrying just far enough. "I will need the names and badge numbers of everyone involved. I will need all footage, and I will need this incident documented in full." "You will have it," the Port Authority official said immediately. "All of it." Becker looked up, then panic breaking through. "Sir, I was just doing my job." The suited man met his eyes. "No, you weren't." Behind them, the cruise ship sounded its horn again, long and low. Boarding announcements resumed over the speakers as if nothing had happened. But the terminal knew better. Everyone watching knew better. 12 minutes earlier, this had been framed as crowd control. Now it was federal interference, fully recorded, impossible to minimize. Hill adjusted the strap of his backpack and stepped back into the sunlight, no longer restrained, no longer questioned. As he walked away, cameras followed him, then slowly turned back toward Becker and the cluster of supervisors now surrounding him. The story had flipped. What had been presented as authority was now exposure. What had been dismissed as a claim was now verified fact. And every second of the mistake lived on in dozens of videos that would not disappear. At that cruise terminal, careers did not end with shouting or force. They ended with confirmation. The consequences arrived faster than anyone expected. Within minutes of the cuffs coming off, the videos were already spreading beyond the terminal. Multiple angles, clear audio, the shove, the cuffs, the word impersonation spoken out loud. By the time the cruise ship finished boarding, the clips had crossed state lines, landing in group chats, private servers, and the inboxes of people whose job was to notice exactly this kind of interference. 12 minutes after the first shove, a call reached Coast Guard District Command. Another followed to Homeland Security. Then one more, higher, quieter, unmistakable in tone. Lieutenant Marcus Hill did not need to make a statement. The footage spoke for him. Time stamped. Location tagged. Faces visible. The incident was no longer a local matter. It had crossed into federal jurisdiction the moment a Coast Guard officer was restrained while performing an assigned security function. By the end of the hour, Officer Ryan Becker was relieved of duty. Not temporarily. Immediately. His supervisor joined him shortly after. Both were escorted out of the terminal, through a side exit, avoiding cameras that had no intention of stopping. An internal investigation was announced publicly before noon. By evening, it had a different name. Joint Federal Review. The Port Authority issued a statement acknowledging a serious breakdown in coordination and protocol. It was careful with language. It had to be. Lawyers were already involved. So were agencies that did not tolerate interference with uniformed service members. At the Pentagon, the response was colder. Shorter. Careers are not debated there. They are assessed. And when an incident threatens operational trust between federal and local security partners, consequences move fast. By the next morning, Becker's badge was cataloged. His access credentials were revoked. His employment status was listed as terminated pending final review. The supervisor who failed to intervene shared the same outcome. 2 careers ended not with sirens or arrests, but with administrative orders that left no room for appeal. Public reaction followed immediately. Veterans groups amplified the story. Maritime security professionals shared it with commentary stripped of emotion and heavy with disappointment. The phrase 12 minutes trended tied directly to the footage and the timeline of federal response. Hill returned to duty without ceremony. He declined interviews. He declined commentary. He filed a formal report, factual and precise, documenting times, commands, physical contact, and witnesses. The report was entered into multiple systems that did not forget. A civil rights lawsuit followed weeks later, measured and devastating. Federal interference, unlawful use of force, violation of constitutional protections. Damages were not symbolic. They reflected the seriousness of disrupting federal security operations at a public port. The settlement came quietly, approved without a fight. The Port Authority agreed to federal oversight, mandatory joint training, and revised protocols that required immediate verification when federal credentials were presented. Local discretion was narrowed. Documentation requirements expanded. Cameras repositioned. Some called it an overreaction. The Pentagon did not. From their perspective, the message was simple. You do not put hands on federal officers performing their duties. You do not escalate when verification is available. And you do not mistake crowd control for authority. For Marcus Hill, the outcome was not personal victory. It was institutional correction. The kind that only happens when mistakes are visible, undeniable, and costly. At that cruise terminal, power did not collapse because someone argued. It collapsed because someone verified. And 12 minutes were all it took to end careers that thought they were untouchable. The final lesson of this story does not belong to the cruise terminal. It belongs to the boundaries that were crossed and the systems that responded when those boundaries were exposed. At a public port, authority is layered. Local police may manage crowds, but they do not supersede federal jurisdiction. A Coast Guard officer performing or coordinating security functions is not a civilian subject to discretionary removal. The shove was not just unnecessary force. It was interference with a federal officer. The cuffs were not precaution. They were a seizure without cause. Legally, the violations were clear. Physical force without an articulable threat. Detention without probable cause. Failure to verify credentials when verification was immediately available. Each step compounded the last, transforming a moment of impatience into a federal issue with measurable consequences. The psychological failure mattered just as much. Bias rarely announces itself as malice. It presents as certainty, as the belief that control must be asserted quickly to prevent embarrassment. In crowded, high-visibility spaces like cruise terminals, that impulse is reinforced. Maintain order. Keep lines moving. Don't let anyone challenge you. When that mindset meets unchecked discretion, escalation becomes the default response to discomfort. Marcus Hill did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not resist. He did what training teaches federal officers to do when local authority misfires. He stayed still. He asked for verification. He allowed the system to document itself. That restraint prevented physical harm and preserved evidence that could not be dismissed later. For viewers, the practical lessons are specific. If you are confronted in a public security space, prioritize safety over pride. Keep your hands visible. State your role clearly. Ask for verification through supervisors or command centers. If force is applied unlawfully, do not escalate physically. Documentation will outlast the moment. If you are a witness, your presence matters. Recording from a safe distance is lawful in most jurisdictions. Do not interfere. Do not taunt. Keep the camera steady. Accountability often begins with ordinary people refusing to look away when power overreaches. And if you wear authority, the lesson is unavoidable. Discretion is not ownership. Crowd control is not domination. When federal credentials are presented, verification is not optional. It is mandatory. Failure to do so is not a misunderstanding. It is misconduct. The Pentagon's response was not emotional. It was procedural. Careers ended because trust was broken in a space where trust is operationally non-negotiable. 12 minutes were enough to demonstrate that escalation without verification carries costs that cannot be negotiated down afterward. Justice in this case was not loud. It was efficient. It did not restore the moment Marcus Hill was shoved in front of strangers. It did not erase the footage, but it did establish a boundary with consequences attached. The uncomfortable question remains: how many similar incidents never reach a federal command desk? How many end quietly, without cameras, without rank, without a system forced to respond? That answer is why this story matters.
Seeking the truth is our ultimate mission. We dig deep to hold power to account, relying entirely on facts and data. Remember, the records never lie. Thank you for tuning in and supporting our work.